For 26 years, I gave everything I had to a woman who only saw value in the child who left. Every single month, I handed over my paycheck without complaint, working 12-hour shifts until my body started breaking down, while my brother, living thousands of miles away, became my mother's entire reason for pride. She told the neighbors about his dollars. She told relatives about his life in America. She never once mentioned my name in those stories, not even after everything I sacrificed just to keep our family standing. I used to believe that if I worked hard enough, if I gave enough of myself, she would finally see me too. I was wrong, and it took something I never expected, something that almost cost us everything, for the truth about both her children to finally come out. What I discovered changed the way I understood love, sacrifice, and what it really means to be seen by the people who are supposed to love us the most. My name is Annika, and for 26 years I believed that being a good daughter was enough to earn my mother's love. I was wrong. I want to tell you exactly how I found that out, because maybe if you've ever felt invisible in your own family, you'll understand every word of what happened to me. I grew up in a small town outside Ahmedabad, in a house with thin walls and a tin roof that turned into a drum every time it rained during monsoon season. My father passed away when I was 11, and after that, it was just my mother, my older brother Raghav, and me. My mother worked as a seamstress, taking in mending jobs from neighbors, and I remember watching her hands move over fabric late into the night, her eyes tired, her back curved from years of bending over a sewing machine. Raghav was 3 years older than me. Growing up, he was the golden child, though I didn't fully understand what that meant until much later. He was allowed to skip chores because he was studying. He was given the bigger portion at dinner because he was growing. He was excused from difficult conversations because he was stressed about his future. Meanwhile, I learned to cook by the time I was 10. I learned to clean the house, wash our clothes by hand, and help my mother with her sewing orders after school. Nobody ever sat me down and told me these were my responsibilities. It simply became understood, the way water finds the lowest point without anyone telling it where to go. I don't say this with bitterness, not back then. I loved my mother deeply, and I loved my brother too, in the complicated way you love someone you've shared a childhood with. I told myself that this was simply how our family worked, that maybe sons and daughters were treated differently everywhere in our community, and that it didn't mean anything about how much she loved me. I told myself a lot of things back then to make the ache in my chest more bearable. When I turned 18, I got a job at a textile factory about 40 minutes from our house. The pay wasn't much, but it was steady. And steady mattered more than almost anything else in our lives. I started working shifts that stretched to 12 hours a day, standing on my feet, breathing in dust and chemical fumes from the dyeing process, my hands developing calluses I still have today. Every single rupee I earned, I brought home. I kept almost nothing for myself. I didn't buy new clothes. I didn't go out with friends because there was no extra money for that kind of life. I gave it all to my mother because I believed, somewhere deep down, that if I gave enough, worked hard enough, sacrificed enough, she would finally look at me the way she looked at Raghav. Raghav, meanwhile, was finishing his studies in engineering, though not particularly well. He failed a year, then struggled to find steady work after graduating. For almost 2 years, he lived at home, unemployed, applying half-heartedly to jobs, while I continued working my long shifts at the factory. During that period, my mother worried about him constantly. She would sigh and say things like, "What will become of my son? He has so much potential, but no opportunities here." She never once said anything similar about me, though I was the one paying for groceries, for the electricity bill, for the medicine she needed for her arthritis. Then, one evening in early spring, when I came home exhausted from my shift, Raghav announced that he had been accepted into a work visa program through a distant cousin who had connections with a company in the United States. It was an entry-level position in logistics, in a city called Cleveland, Ohio. I remember the way my mother's face changed that night. It was as if someone had switched on a light behind her eyes that I had never seen before, not even on her wedding anniversary. Not even on the day I brought home my first full paycheck. She cried tears of joy that night. She hugged Raghav so tightly I thought she might not let go. She kept saying over and over, "My son is going to America. My son is going to America." I stood in the doorway of our small kitchen, watching this scene unfold, and I felt something strange settle in my stomach. Something I couldn't name yet, but would come to know intimately over the following years. The weeks before Raghav left were filled with preparation. My mother sold 2 of her gold bangles, the ones she had kept since her own wedding, to help pay for his plane ticket and initial expenses. She didn't hesitate for a second. When I once gently asked if we could use some of that money instead to fix the roof, which leaked every monsoon season, she looked at me as if I had suggested something absurd. "This is different, Annika," she said. "This is your brother's future. This is our family's future." I didn't understand yet what she meant by that, but I would understand very soon. When Raghav left for America, my mother cried at the airport in a way I had never seen her cry. Not even at my father's funeral. She held on to him until security asked her to step back. On the drive home, she was quiet, staring out the window, and I remember reaching over to hold her hand. She let me hold it, but her mind was clearly somewhere else, thousands of miles away, already following her son across the ocean. For the first 2 months, things were simple. My mother missed Raghav terribly. She would call him every few days, listening to his voice for as long as the international calling card would allow. Then hanging up and telling me how hard it was for him, how cold the weather was, how strange the food was, how much he was struggling to adjust. I felt for him too. I did. He was my brother, and adjusting to a new country alone must have been frightening. But then something shifted. Raghav found steady work at a warehouse, earning wages that, when converted to rupees, seemed enormous to us. And the very first month he received his paycheck, he sent money home. Not a small amount either. Enough that my mother stood in our kitchen, holding the transfer slip in her hands like it was a sacred document, reading the number over and over as if she couldn't quite believe it. That was the moment everything changed. That was the moment my mother stopped simply missing her son and started worshiping him. She began telling everyone, our neighbors, our relatives, the vendors at the local market, the women she sewed for, even strangers she barely knew. "My son is in America," she would say, her chin lifting slightly with every retelling. "He sends us dollars every single month. Do you know how much that converts to? He is such a good boy, so responsible, so hardworking." She said this so often that some of our neighbors began referring to me simply as Raghav's sister, as though my own identity had dissolved into being an extension of his success. I remember standing beside her once at a family gathering as she told this same story to my aunt for what must have been the 10th time that year. My aunt turned to me at one point and asked politely how my job at the factory was going. Before I could answer, my mother waved her hand dismissively and said, "Oh, she just works at the factory. Nothing special." But Raghav, now that is something to be proud of. Nothing special. I had been working 12-hour shifts for years. I had given every single rupee I earned to keep our household running. I had skipped meals so there would be enough food for my mother. I had never once complained, never once asked for recognition, because I believed that love wasn't supposed to be transactional, that a mother's pride shouldn't depend on geography or currency exchange rates. But standing there that day, hearing her call my sacrifice nothing special, while praising my brother's dollars as though they were miracles from heaven, something inside me cracked quietly, like a hairline fracture in glass that you don't notice until much later, when the whole thing shatters. I didn't say anything that day. I smiled, I nodded, I helped serve the food to our guests, just like always. But that night, lying in my bed, staring at the water stains on our ceiling, I asked myself a question I had never dared to ask before. What if my mother's love had never truly belonged to me at all? I didn't know yet how much worse things would get, or how long it would take before the truth about my brother's life in America, and about my mother's blind pride, would finally come crashing down around all of us. The months after that family gathering passed in a strange blur. I kept working my shifts at the factory, kept handing over my paycheck to my mother, kept cooking dinner every night and cleaning the house on my only day off. Nothing about my daily life changed. What changed was the way I started to see it. Once you notice a pattern, you cannot unnotice it. That's the thing nobody tells you about painful realizations. Before that day at my aunt's house, I had been able to convince myself that my mother's favoritism toward Raghav was simply a habit left over from childhood, something that would eventually balance out as we both grew older. But now I began paying closer attention, and what I saw broke my heart, piece by piece. Every month, like clockwork, Raghav would send money through a wire transfer service. The amount varied slightly, but it was always substantial by our standards. And every single month, my mother would receive that transfer with the same ritual. She would put on her nicest sari, walk to the small money transfer office in town, and collect the funds personally, even though it would have been easier for the office to just handle it electronically into her bank account. I realized later that she did this on purpose. She wanted to be seen walking to that office. She wanted people to ask her what she was doing there, so she could tell them, again, about her son in America. Meanwhile, my own contributions became almost invisible in comparison. I handed my mother my paycheck in a plain envelope, at home, in private, with no fanfare and no audience. There was no ritual attached to my sacrifice. No story worth telling the neighbors. Just a tired daughter, handing over money she desperately needed for herself, but never kept. I want to be honest with you. There were nights during this period when I cried myself to sleep, quietly, so my mother wouldn't hear me through the thin wall between our rooms. I would ask myself what was wrong with me, why I couldn't seem to earn the same pride from her that Raghav received simply for existing on another continent. I began to wonder if the problem was something inherent in me, some flaw I couldn't see, rather than something in the way she chose to measure love. Around this time, I started noticing changes in my own health. The long hours at the factory had already taken a toll on my body, but stress compounded everything. I developed chronic pain in my lower back and shoulders from standing at my station for 12 hours a day. I started experiencing headaches that would last for days. I lost weight because I often skipped meals, telling myself I wasn't hungry when really I was just trying to make sure there was enough food for my mother, who had started developing more serious arthritis in her hands and knees. One evening, I fainted at the factory. I had been standing for nearly 10 hours without a proper break, dehydrated and exhausted, and everything went black for a moment before I collapsed near my station. My co-workers rushed to help me, and one of them, a woman named Priya, who had become something like a friend over the years, drove me home herself because she was worried about me traveling alone in that condition. When we arrived at my house, my mother opened the door and saw Priya helping me inside, my legs still unsteady beneath me. For one brief moment, I saw something flicker across her face, a genuine flash of fear and concern. She rushed forward and helped me to the couch, asking Priya what happened, fussing over me in a way she rarely did. For just a few minutes, I felt something I had been starving for my entire life. I felt like her daughter, but that feeling didn't last. Within an hour, after Priya had left, and I was resting on the couch with a cool cloth on my forehead, my mother's phone rang. It was Raghav, calling for their weekly conversation. I watched her face transform instantly. The worry disappeared, replaced by that same glowing pride I had come to recognize and resent. She walked into the kitchen to take the call privately, and though I couldn't hear every word, I heard enough. I heard her laughing. I heard her telling him how proud she was of him for a recent promotion he had received at the warehouse, something about being made a shift supervisor. I heard her say, "You are truly making something of your life over there." I lay on that couch, my body still weak from fainting just an hour earlier, and listened to my mother praise my brother's career advancement while I had just collapsed from exhaustion, working to support our household. And she hadn't even asked me if I was feeling better before taking that call. That night became a turning point for me, though I didn't fully understand it yet. I began to accept, slowly and painfully, that my mother's love and pride were not things I could earn through effort or sacrifice. They seemed to be tied entirely to something else, something about status, about being able to tell a story that made her look good to others, about geography and money in a way that had nothing to do with the quality of a person's heart or the depth of their devotion. I started talking to Priya more about my situation during our breaks at the factory. She was one of the only people who truly understood what I was going through, because her own family had similar dynamics, though not quite as extreme. She would listen to me describe another incident, another moment where my mother dismissed my contributions while celebrating Raghav's from thousands of miles away, and she would shake her head slowly. "Annika," she said to me one afternoon during our lunch break, sitting on overturned crates behind the factory building, "you need to understand something. Some parents love their children based on what those children can give them, not based on who those children actually are. It's not fair, and it's not right, but it happens more than you think. Her words stayed with me for weeks. I turned them over in my mind constantly, trying to reconcile them with the mother I had known my whole life, the woman who had raised me alone after my father's death, who had worked her fingers, raw sewing clothes for other people to keep us fed. How could that same woman be capable of such selective love? How could she value dollars over devotion, distance over dedication? I began to research quietly in my limited free time, using the shared computer at an internet cafe near the factory. I wanted to understand if what Priya said was true, if this was a common pattern in families like mine. What I found, reading forum posts and articles from other immigrant families, other siblings who had been left behind, confirmed my growing suspicion. There was actually a term for what my mother was experiencing, something psychologists called it, related to status and social validation within tight-knit communities where having a child abroad, especially in America, carried immense social capital. It wasn't about Raghav specifically. It was about what he represented to her, what he allowed her to become in the eyes of everyone around her. This realization was both a relief and a devastating blow. On one hand, it meant I wasn't inherently unlovable, that there wasn't some deep flaw in me that made me unworthy of my mother's pride. On the other hand, it meant that no amount of sacrifice on my part would ever be enough to compete with what Raghav's location on a map could offer her. Around 8 months after Raghav's departure, my mother started making a new kind of comment that cut even deeper than before. She began comparing me directly to him in conversations, not just praising him separately, but actively diminishing my efforts by contrast. "If only you had gone abroad too," she said one evening while we were eating dinner, completely unprompted. "Imagine how proud I could be of both my children." I remember setting down my spoon and staring at her, my chest tight with a feeling I couldn't quite name. "Ma," I said carefully, "I work 12 hours a day. I give you almost everything I earn. I take care of this house. I take care of you." She waved her hand, the same dismissive gesture I had seen her use countless times before. "That's different," she said. "That's just what daughters do. But sending dollars from America, that is something special. That is something to be proud of. That's just what daughters do." Those 6 words replayed in my mind for months afterward. They told me everything I needed to know about how my mother viewed my role in this family. I wasn't someone whose sacrifices deserved recognition. I was simply fulfilling an obligation, an expected duty that came with being born a girl in our household, while Raghav's contributions, identical in spirit though different in currency, were treated as extraordinary acts of heroism. I didn't yet know that things were about to become even more complicated, that Raghav's life in America was not exactly what my mother believed it to be, and that a phone call I would receive nearly a year later would begin to unravel everything she thought she knew about her golden son. Almost a year after Raghav left for America, something happened that would slowly begin to crack the perfect image my mother had built in her mind. It started with something small, something I almost didn't notice at first, but looking back now, I understand it was the very first thread that would eventually unravel everything. Raghav's monthly transfers, which had been arriving like clockwork for nearly 10 months, suddenly started becoming irregular. One month, the amount was significantly smaller than usual. My mother didn't say much about it at the time, just mentioned it briefly while sorting through her sewing supplies, saying that Raghav must have had some unexpected expenses that month. The following month, no transfer came at all. She waited, checking the money transfer office twice that week, coming home each time a little more anxious than before. When she finally called him to ask what had happened, I was in the next room, folding laundry, but I could hear pieces of the conversation through our thin walls. Her voice, usually so warm and proud when speaking to him, had taken on an edge of worry I hadn't heard before. "Is everything all right?" she kept asking. "Did something happen at your job?" Raghav's explanation, as she later relayed it to me over dinner, was that the warehouse had cut his hours because of a slowdown in shipments, something about seasonal changes in demand. He assured her it was temporary, that things would pick back up soon, and that she shouldn't worry. My mother accepted this explanation completely, without a shred of doubt, the same way she accepted everything Raghav told her. But something about the story didn't sit right with me, though I couldn't have told you exactly why at the time. Over the following months, the pattern continued. Sometimes he sent money, sometimes he didn't. Sometimes the excuses were about work, sometimes about unexpected bills, sometimes about needing to save for something he called an opportunity that he refused to explain in detail. My mother, despite the inconsistency, never once expressed doubt about her son. If anything, his struggles seemed to deepen her devotion to him. She would say things like, "My poor son, working so hard in a foreign country, dealing with so much pressure alone. No one understands how difficult it is for him." I remember biting my tongue during these conversations more times than I can count. I wanted to remind her that I too worked incredibly hard, that I too dealt with pressure, that I too was, in a sense, alone in my struggles because she had never once offered me the same tenderness she reserved for him. But I said nothing, because by this point I had learned that voicing these thoughts only led to arguments where I was accused of being jealous, ungrateful, or unable to understand the sacrifices Raghav was making for our family. The real turning point came about 14 months after Raghav's departure, when my mother received a phone call late one evening from a woman she didn't recognize. I was in the kitchen washing dishes when I heard my mother's confused voice from the living room, asking the caller to repeat herself, asking who she was and how she knew Raghav. I dried my hands quickly and walked into the living room, watching my mother's face shift from confusion to something closer to alarm. She kept saying, "I don't understand. Can you explain again?" After several minutes, she hung up the phone and sat down heavily on our old sofa, staring at nothing in particular. "Ma, what happened?" I asked, sitting beside her. She explained slowly, piecing together what the woman had told her. The caller was someone named Sarita, a fellow Indian immigrant living in Cleveland who had become friendly with Raghav through their local community temple. Sarita explained that she was calling because she was concerned. She had noticed Raghav hadn't been attending temple gatherings recently, and when she had run into him at a local grocery store a few weeks prior, he looked unwell, thinner than she remembered, with dark circles under his eyes. She mentioned that she had heard, through mutual acquaintances in the community, that Raghav had actually lost his warehouse job months earlier, not just had his hours reduced, as he had told my mother, and that he had been struggling significantly since then. My mother sat there in stunned silence after relaying this information to me. "That can't be right," she said, more to herself than to me. "He told me his hours were just cut. He said things were getting better." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to comfort her, and part of me, a part I'm not proud of, but that existed nonetheless, felt a strange, complicated satisfaction that the truth was finally beginning to surface. Not because I wanted my brother to suffer, but because I desperately wanted my mother to see reality clearly, to understand that the golden image she had built of Raghav's life in America might not be entirely accurate. That night, my mother called Raghav directly and confronted him about what Sarita had told her. I listened from the next room again, my heart pounding as her voice grew increasingly distressed. Eventually, after what must have been nearly an hour of conversation, she came out of her room, her eyes red from crying, and told me the truth. Raghav had indeed lost his warehouse job nearly 5 months earlier. The company had gone through layoffs, and he had been among those let go. Since then, he had been struggling to find steady work, taking odd jobs here and there, sometimes driving for a rideshare service, sometimes doing manual labor for cash when he could find it. He had been too ashamed to tell our mother the truth, worried that admitting failure would destroy the image she had built of him, an image he himself had begun to depend on for his own sense of worth. Even more difficult to hear was that Raghav had actually been struggling financially for months, sometimes barely making rent on the small apartment he shared with 2 roommates, sometimes skipping meals himself to afford basic necessities. The money he had continued sending home occasionally, even during this difficult period, had come at tremendous personal cost. He had been borrowing from friends, using credit cards he could barely pay back, all to maintain the illusion that everything in America was going according to plan. My mother was devastated by this revelation, but I want to be honest with you about something that surprised me deeply. Even after learning that Raghav had been lying to her for months, even after understanding the sacrifices he had made simply to preserve her pride in him, her immediate reaction was not anger at being deceived. Instead, it was overwhelming sympathy for him, mixed with a kind of renewed determination to help him however she could. "He's struggling so much, and he didn't want to worry me," she said, wiping tears from her eyes. "My poor boy, carrying this burden alone." I sat there, listening to her express concern and sympathy for Raghav's months of struggle, and I thought about my own struggles, the fainting spell at the factory, the chronic pain in my back and shoulders, the sleepless nights worrying about how we would pay for her arthritis medication. I had never once lied to her about my difficulties, had never once hidden my exhaustion or my sacrifices, and yet none of it had ever generated this same depth of maternal concern. In the weeks following this revelation, my mother's behavior toward Raghav's situation became almost obsessive. She began sending him small amounts of money herself, using funds that came primarily from my paycheck to help him get through this difficult period. She would ask me for extra money, explaining that Raghav needed help finding a new apartment because he could no longer afford rent with his roommates, or that he needed money for a course he wanted to take to improve his job prospects. I gave the money each time she asked, not because I wanted to, but because refusing felt impossible within the dynamics of our household. Each time I handed over funds meant for my own basic needs, I felt that same familiar ache returning. The recognition that I was once again being asked to sacrifice for a golden child who received endless sympathy for his struggles, while my own struggles remained invisible, unworthy of the same tenderness. What made this period particularly painful was watching how my mother's narrative to others in our community shifted, but not in the way I expected. Rather than admitting that Raghav had lost his job and was struggling, she began telling an even more elaborate story, one about how he was between opportunities and exploring better career options in America. The lie about his circumstances had somehow transformed, in her retelling, into an even grander tale of ambition and potential, rather than the more complicated reality of unemployment and financial hardship. I began to realize, during this period, that my mother's pride in Raghav had very little to do with actual facts or achievements. It had become something almost independent of reality itself, a story she needed to tell herself and others to maintain her own sense of dignity and status within our community. And I was beginning to understand that no truth, however damaging, would be enough to shatter that carefully constructed narrative. But I had no idea, not yet, just how much further this situation would spiral, or how a single unexpected event back home would finally force my mother to confront everything she had refused to see for years about both her children. The event that finally changed everything happened almost 2 years after Raghav first left for America, and it began with the worst phone call of my life. It was a Tuesday evening, and I had just returned home from my shift at the factory when my mother collapsed in our kitchen. I heard a loud crash from the other room, the sound of pottery breaking, and when I rushed in, I found her on the floor, clutching her chest, her face pale and covered in sweat. I didn't waste a single second. I called for help immediately, and with the assistance of our neighbor, we managed to get her to the nearest hospital. The doctors told us she had suffered a heart attack, brought on by a combination of stress, years of physical strain from her work as a seamstress, and untreated high blood pressure that none of us had realized was so severe. She would need immediate surgery, a procedure that would cost more money than our family had ever had to gather at once. I remember standing in that hospital corridor, my hands shaking, calling Raghav to tell him what had happened. His voice on the phone was full of shock and worry, but when I explained the financial situation, when I told him how much we needed for the surgery and the recovery care that would follow, there was a long silence on the line. Eventually, he admitted that he simply didn't have the money. His own situation in America, despite months of my mother's continued support, had barely stabilized. He had found part-time work at a different warehouse, but it wasn't nearly enough to send home any significant amount, let alone cover a portion of emergency surgery costs. I felt something inside me go completely still in that moment, a strange kind of clarity settling over the panic. I understood, with absolute certainty, that if my mother's life was going to be saved, it would be because of me, not because of the golden sun living thousands of miles away. I spent the following days in a blur of desperate action. I took out a loan against my future wages at the factory, something my supervisor reluctantly agreed to, given my years of loyal service. I sold the small gold earrings my father had given me before he passed away, one of the only possessions I owned that held any real value. I borrowed money from Priya and several other co-workers who had come to know our family's struggles over the years. Piece by piece, rupee by rupee, I gathered enough to cover my mother's surgery. During her recovery in the hospital, I was the one who stayed by her bedside every single night, sleeping in an uncomfortable plastic chair, making sure she took her medications on schedule, feeding her when she was too weak to hold a spoon herself, and handling every conversation with doctors about her treatment plan. Raghav called occasionally, his voice full of guilt and concern, but calls from thousands of miles away could not change bedsheets or administer medication or hold a trembling hand through the pain of recovery. It was during one of these long nights in the hospital, when my mother was slowly regaining her strength, that something shifted between us in a way I had never expected. She woke up in the middle of the night, disoriented from her medication, and found me sitting beside her bed, my head resting against the wall, exhausted but present. She reached over and took my hand, something she rarely did, and she began to cry softly. "Annika," she said, her voice weak but clear, "you have always been here. Through everything, you have always been the one who stayed." I didn't know how to respond at first. Years of feeling invisible, of feeling like my sacrifices meant nothing compared to distant dollars, had built up a wall around my heart that I wasn't sure how to lower in that moment. But I squeezed her hand gently and said, "I love you, Ma. I always have." Over the following weeks, as my mother continued her recovery at home, something in her began to change, slowly but unmistakably. She started noticing things about my life that she had overlooked for years. She noticed how tired I looked after my shifts. She noticed the calluses on my hands from years of factory work. She began asking me questions about my own dreams, things I had given up long ago because there had never been space in our family narrative for my ambitions. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes during her recovery, she found a folder I had kept hidden for years, containing brochures and notes about a nursing program I had once dreamed of pursuing before financial obligations to our family made that dream impossible. She sat with that folder in her lap for a long time, and when I found her there, she looked up at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before, something that looked remarkably like regret. "Why didn't you ever tell me about this?" she asked. "Because it never seemed to matter," I said honestly, perhaps more honestly than I had ever spoken to her before. "You were always so focused on Raghav's life in America. There was never room to talk about what I wanted." The silence that followed felt heavier than any conversation we had ever had. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling slightly. "I think I made a terrible mistake, Annika. I spent so many years being proud of a story about dollars and distance, that I never stopped to see the daughter standing right in front of me, giving up everything for this family without ever once asking for recognition. I won't pretend that conversation fixed everything instantly, because healing years of feeling unseen doesn't happen in a single afternoon, but it was the beginning of something new between us. A slow and careful rebuilding of a relationship that had been unbalanced for far too long. In the months that followed, my mother made a conscious effort to change how she spoke about her children to others in our community. She began telling people about my dedication at the factory, about the surgery I had paid for entirely on my own, about the nursing program I eventually decided to pursue part-time, studying in the evenings after my shifts, determined to build something for myself after years of putting everyone else first. Raghav's situation in America eventually stabilized, though it took much longer than anyone had anticipated, and he never quite returned to the golden status he once held in our mother's eyes, not because she stopped loving him, but because she finally understood that love measured only in distance and dollars had blinded her to the daughter who had been quietly holding our family together the entire time. I think about those years often, the exhaustion, the invisible sacrifices, the desperate hope that one day my mother would see me the way she saw my brother. I learned something important through that painful journey, something I carry with me even now as I continue building my own life, studying to become a nurse, slowly stepping into a future I once thought I didn't deserve to want. I learned that love given freely, without expectation of recognition, still has value, even when it goes unseen for years. I learned that sometimes the people who sacrifice the most are the ones who receive the least acknowledgement, simply because their sacrifices don't come wrapped in the impressive packaging of distance or foreign currency. And I learned that sometimes it takes a crisis, something as devastating as nearly losing a parent, to finally open eyes that had been closed by pride and circumstance for far too long. My mother and I are closer now than we have ever been. She still worries about Raghav, as any mother would, but she no longer measures her pride in either of her children by geography or income. She sees me now, fully and completely, as her daughter, who never left, who never needed to cross an ocean to prove her love, because she had been proving it every single day, in every quiet sacrifice nobody ever thought to notice.